When Mike asked me to do a presentation, he gave me no suggestions about what to talk about. And it's kind of interesting as we've gone through and listened to Mark Van Appen and also the questions that were presented to the panel, because there's some commonality between all of those pieces and the topic that I decided to address this afternoon. And the presentation is on Oars, and not O-A-R-S, but O-R-S, and not the Oregon Revised Statutes Oars either. But I'm talking about the oars that we encounter throughout our profession. There's lots of them, and I define the oars as topics or philosophies or perspectives that seem to divide us and generate a lot of hate and discontent. And I actually started thinking about this before the presidential election get into full swing and so forth. But I think it's reflected in our society today. But we kind of have that in our own profession as well. And one of the things I noticed working as an instructor for a lot of years was that many times people wanted to know what was the answer. The one singular answer to whatever their question happened to be. And they didn't like it if you said, well, it depends. They want to know what's the answer. And once they got the answer, that became maybe the way that they kind of looked at that particular question or that particular issue. And they didn't struggle if somebody came along that maybe had a little different perspective. And Dennis talked about that, about trying to figure out, well, why is it that people do things in a particular way? There's usually a reason. If we go back in history and we look at that. So I decided to visit with this a little bit, and I wanted to take on two of the oars that I've encountered in my life. The first one impacted on me in kind of a personal way, and then the second one is one that I find particularly interesting. Last week I was down in San Bernardino, California, doing some fire behavior training, or actually I guess it's still this week, and they were wrestling with some interesting questions, and it kind of tied into this, even though I had been thinking about that before I went down there, but that helped me bring it into clarity. So we'll just jump into it and see how it goes. So there's a number of oars, and one that kind of goes back generations, and it's still being wrestled with today, is things like fog streams or solid streams. Which is better? I'm not going to answer that question this afternoon. I wouldn't even try and answer that question this afternoon. Science or belief? And that kind of impacts not only on our profession, but I think it's pervasive throughout society, is that we encounter people that believe certain things and may or may not be backed up by evidence, but they're perfectly happy to believe them. And then there's other people that say, unless I have evidence and it's backed up with scientific proof, then I'm not gonna buy into that. And they oftentimes are at loggerheads. Slicers or Recio VS. And that's one that we are going to talk about a little bit later, because the guys down in San Bernardino were kind of wrestling around with this a little bit, and I've been thinking about this, looking at comments on social media and so forth, and find it kind of interesting. That one I may have an answer to. Interior, exterior. I've been involved in a lot of the research that UL has been doing, and I hear people say, oh, well, they're saying it's only from the outside. They don't want us to go inside. That's one perspective. Fly in or fly out. Experience or education. So the two that I decided I was going to talk about, because I think that the presentation, Mike thought it was a test, to see if I could actually do something in 20 minutes. But we're going to take a look at experience or education and kind of wrestle with that a little bit, and then that's going to feed into our look at slicers and Recio. I read a quote by a gentleman named Gisborne who was in the Forest Service, and he was a fire behavior guy, but he was a wildland fire behavior guy. And so I took his quote and that I read, and I kind of adapted it to the structural environment because that's kind of where I live. And he said, "For what is experience judgment except opinion based on knowledge acquired by experience? If you fought fires in every type of building, with every different configuration and fuel load under all types of conditions, and if you remembered exactly what's happened in each of these combinations, your experience judgment is probably very good." Now, I don't think any of us fit that category. Some of us have been to more fires than others. Some of us because we're in a very busy house. Some of us because we're really old. But we don't remember everything. And when we go through an experience, we also have to frame that based on the way that we understand things work. So that kind of leads into this question about experience versus education. My dad was a fire chief. He started in the fire service in 1938. And I went to my first fire when I was 6 weeks old. I had no choice. I was kind of brought to the fire. And one of the captains wrote my name down on the alarm roster. I would really like to have a copy of that. But so I kind of grew up in the firehouse. And I gained a lot of experiences by following my dad around. Some of that was experiences in what does an incident commander do? How's the fire ground managed? I mean, that was kind of my first perspective because I was hanging out with the IC. He didn't call himself that at the time. He was just a fire chief running fires, standing in the front yard, pointing, telling people what to do and the like. But that was the beginning of my experience. I also began to encounter some other people. I met one of the senior guys in his fire department, and he taught me how to run a pump when I was about 12. And then I encountered a whole series of other senior guys who passed their experience on to me as I began my career. And I went to school. My dad took me to talk to 3 fire chiefs before I got hired in the fire department. One was the fire chief in the city of Boston, one was the fire chief in the city of Chelsea, and the chief in the city of Arlington, Massachusetts. And they all gave me some advice, and they all told me to go to school. I said, okay, makes sense to me. So I went to the local community college and started working on my degree. I then get hired by the fire department. I continued going to school. I kind of continued that for about 30 some odd years. But education formed the basis of understanding. I was always one of those people that asked why, back when asking why wasn't popular. And education kind of gave me the answer of why. And there were subjects I liked, and there were subjects I didn't like. You know, I didn't like that sociology and psychology and English and writing and that stuff. I liked the fire classes. But the further along I went in my career, the more I found that those things were important as well. One of the questions in my mind as I was kind of going through that is, you know, are we a blue-collar trade or are we a profession? That's another or. I think it's an and. We're both. I kind of expanded my experience and my education when I got connected with some people outside the United States, and I started to go and see what is it that they did. And my first trip outside the United States as a member of the fire service was to Sweden, and I learned some interesting things. I came back and I inflicted those on my colleagues in Gresham. And again, that's led me to some other places. But again, that was some experience, and I had to process that based on what do I understand our work to be? What is it? How does it work? And I combined that with work on the fire ground. Again, some more experience. And then I continued on, and I decided after I finished a bachelor's degree at Eastern Oregon University, I decided, you know, maybe I'm going to go take some classes at Portland State. And I ended up getting a master's degree and continuing on a little bit before that and studying education because I was a chief training officer, and I found there was a lot of value in that. But it wasn't about just education. If I just had the education, that wouldn't have been enough. And if I just had the experience, I might have get by with that a lot of the time, but my experience didn't answer the question why. It didn't give me that deeper foundational understanding of how is it that things work. So it's an and. not an or. Now, does that mean that everybody in the fire service ought to have a master's degree? Not necessarily. I know there was one of my colleagues on the panel up here that talked about traveling around and looking at how other people do things, and that was his education. That's tremendous. That also is education, as long as we're asking the right questions. Why is it that they do it that way? So it's experience and education. Now, sometimes the education comes in the form of a university, and sometimes the education comes in other places. I think it can come more than one way. I mean, I found my formal education to be very valuable, but only when I connected it with experience. Some of that experience was going to fires, some of that experience was doing other things. So Calvin Coolidge said, knowledge comes, but wisdom lingers. It may not be difficult to store up in the mind a vast quantity of facts within a comparatively short time, but the ability to form judgments requires severe discipline of hard work and the tempering heat of experience and maturity. And the interesting thing, if I look back over my career, I started on the job when I was 19 years old, and I thought I knew a bunch of stuff. I know a lot less today. I was far more certain of things back then. Back then I looked at guys with 20 years on the job. I mean, there was a guy that I had working for me when I was a captain that I was really impressed with the fact that he had been on the job when I was born. He had 26 years on the job. Today, well, I would say that's a young guy. That's a young guy. I look at it a lot differently today than I did back then. I didn't quite have the respect for experience then as I do today. Again, I'm in a different place. I think I also didn't have the respect of it for education back then that I do today. But very important that we've got that and in there, and we draw from both of those things. It's not one or the other. So we're going to apply this to something that there's been a lot of discussion about. I know I read a lot of this on social media and so forth about slicers versus Recio, and there's some other mnemonic devices that help us remember things. And when I really think about these methods to memorize information, the place where I found them to be most useful was in answering questions on multiple choice tests. Well, the Fireground isn't a multiple choice test. It's a little bit more like an essay test. There's no set of predefined answers hanging out there in front of us that we get to say, okay, well, I think it's this one. We have to be able to make decisions. We have to be able to exercise judgment. Now, there's some things that people criticize about both of these, and it's interesting because if I go back and I think about 25 or 30 years ago when people were looking at Recio and saying, well, ventilation is at the end. It's out of order. It needs to be in the front. Maybe after rescue, but it's got to be earlier in this thing. And that's sort of the same sort of conversations that people are having today about rescue and slicers. Now, these different devices, these mnemonics, are just a useful way for us to remember some things that need to be done, maybe to remember the order of things. But I don't think they're the answer, because it's not an or. It's not slicers or Recio. I think there's something we can take away from both of these things. We might say, and these are some of the arguments I hear online, inside or outside? Does slicers mean we're writing off the citizens? Is it we're condemning the citizens to death? I mean, the rhetoric is really pretty out there when you start to look at this. Is rescue an opportunity or priority? Well, it may be both. But we tend to form these polarized perspectives because we're trying to force everything into a box. It's either this or this, black or white. So I'd contend that really what it's about, if we take and we apply experience and education, we think about what does our experience tell us about how tactics work on the fire ground, and we apply our education, in this context, our understanding about the fire environment. I'm a big fire dynamics and fire behavior guy, so I think if we understand that, and we understand the performance of buildings, and we understand how the fire environment impacts on both the citizens and ourselves, if we understand those things, and we can look at our experience through that lens, I think we can come up with an answer to this that makes sense. Size up, making sense out of what it is that's going on. What's happening now? What's likely to happen next? If we don't have a good practical and theoretical understanding of fire dynamics, we can't answer that question, and everything's going to be a big surprise. We take that and we identify the critical factors. That leads us to an action plan, and then we go to work. And it's kind of like fire flow formulas. I don't know anybody that uses fire flow formulas on the fire ground. Does it mean we shouldn't learn about that? No. But it means that we typically base hose line selection on experience. Experience framed by our understanding of why we might need a particular amount of water. So when it comes to tactical decisions, I think it's the same thing. Those mnemonic devices to say, let's organize this, let's have a discussion around these topics, that's a very good thing. But at the end of the day, I don't know anybody that thinks about that mnemonic as they're pulling up on the fire ground. So what we need to do is we need to synthesize those things into an and instead of saying, okay, this is an or. I'm going to be resistant to these concepts because there's some really good things in slicers, as we'll find out a little bit later this afternoon. We're going to talk about some of those concepts, not using that mnemonic, but we're going to talk about those concepts. And then once we have a plan of action, then go to work. So when we look at the oars, one of the things that's really important is to think about our perspective. Is the object in the middle circular or is it square? Depends on your perspective. And the same thing holds true with most of the oars in the fire service. It's not necessarily about right or wrong, good or bad. It's about perspective. And if we don't understand how we're seeing it, what lens we're using, what lens the other people are using, and why they see it differently, and if we can't have that discussion in a respectful way, we're probably not going to be able to make sense out of it. But if we can, we're probably going to get to a better place. So if we think about what is our mission, what are our values? What do we think is important? And what's our vision? What's our vision for the future? And one question that I've asked people in our organization is, what do you want your legacy to be? And this kind of goes back to Ray's question from earlier today. What do you want your legacy to be? We want to leave our profession better? How do we want to leave it better? What do we want our legacy to be? Well, I think part of that is thinking about those oars and how can we make sense of those things and move that forward and get to a place where it's an and, not an or. Thank you.